Yes.
All right. Welcome, everybody, to New Hampshire Peace Action's Peace and Justice Conversation Series online. I'm Will Hopkins. I'm the director of New Hampshire Peace Action. In case you're new to us, we educate, mobilize, and organize to build a more peaceful and just future for all. We envisage a future where international relations are based on cooperation instead of competition and conflict, and where mutual benefit and shared security lead to a more peaceful and just global community. The corona pandemic spurred us to start this bi-weekly conversation series as a way to continue our public education work, but we found it so effective at reaching out that we've decided to continue it indefinitely. The series is intended for us to help engage and sort out how to make the changes we've been yearning for. In the spirit of understanding and respect, we'd like to acknowledge that we're doing our work here in New Hampshire on the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples past and present. And we honor with gratitude the land and waterways that they have been stewarding throughout the generations. So tonight, I'm really excited. This is a topic I'm really interested to hear what our speakers have to say. We're bringing Steve Thornton and Peter Kellman to talk about the relationship between labor and the peace movement. And it's kind of a complicated relationship in a lot of ways. Peace movements peace activists tend to be progressive Democrats with a serious commitment to labor. But we recognize that sometimes labor depends on Pentagon contracts, and that makes things really complicated. And the fact that labor is far more powerful in the Democratic Party means that frequently we feel like our voices aren't heard, and that's made things complicated. So we've asked Steve and Peter to kind of walk us through and talk us through how that works. Steve has been an activist for more than 45 years, mostly in Hartford, Connecticut. Works on housing, anti-racism, and union organizing. He's also done two different really interesting history projects. There's one that's History of Below, which is stories of Hartford's people, labor in Hartford, and their organizing in history. And the other is the Shoe Leather History Project. So his work has focused on building multiracial coalitions for economic and social justice in order to build a new society within the shell of the old. Peter is one of Rob Shetterly's Americans Who Tell the Truth. He's been a frontline participant in U.S. labor and social movements starting in the 1960s and continuing through today. He's currently part of the new agriculture movement in Maine. His experience as a civil rights worker, an anti-war demonstrator, an environment and anti-nuclear activist, a union organizer, and a labor historian and researcher. Peter and Steve, thank you so much for giving us some time tonight to talk us through this, and I'll let you take it away.
Thanks. Well, good evening, sisters and brothers. I'm really pleased to be invited here tonight, especially with my longtime co-conspirator, Peter Kellman. Before we begin, since I get to go first for some reason, let me acknowledge that today marks the birthday of Dorothy Day, and the co-founder of Catholic Worker, as you know, and a lifelong activist in various workers' movements, and an opponent of all wars. And also, this Thursday, we commemorate the death of the Haymarket martyrs, 4 of whom were hanged in 1887 by the state of Illinois. That trial was a travesty, and 6 years later, the governor granted the men a full pardon. So this is a special week in a lot of ways. The question, I guess, is how we create relationships between the anti-nuclear weapons movement, the peace movement, and the labor movement. And this is not an academic question. It's not a question we should just decide we put on the agenda once every 5 years. I think it's the key to building a world without nuclear destruction, the kind of world we really want. The complex question, though, of jobs versus nukes is not a contradiction. It's a paradox. So are we supporting jobs if we favor immigrants crossing the border to take jobs? Can we say we support jobs if we shut down coal mining and oil pipelines? Can we support jobs if we boycott businesses that discriminate against LGBT customers? Do we support jobs if we support the $15 minimum wage and unionization? Every chamber of commerce in the United States will tell you, no, we don't support jobs. But we know we do, and that it's not a contradiction. It's a puzzle that we need to work out. And my point here is that labor and peace have worked together and will continue to do so into the future. I'd say we need to speed that up a little bit, but like the law of inertia, the physics law, if a movement does not constantly work on its alliances, it's much harder moving forward. And I would argue that the peace movement and the labor movements are inert pretty much when it comes to this kind of alliance. So my observations break down into 3 parts tonight, brief ones, I hope. First, a little pop quiz to loosen up the conversation. Second, a brief history of unions and war and how unions have stood in regard to U.S. wars. And third, a few lessons that I think I've learned that can be generally applied. So let me give you the names first of 5 very famous historical figures. And if this is too simple for you, forgive me. But the 5 are Mohandas Gandhi, Frederick Douglass, A.J. Muste, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Dolores Huerta. What do they have in common? Well, what they have in common is that they're all union organizers, not just union supporters or proponents. They actually founded and led working people in working people's struggles. Gandhi, as you probably know, organized thousands of textile workers in South Africa, indigo plantation workers, and others, and stopped the importation to India of South African indentured workers. Frederick Douglass organized with Isaac Myers in 1869 the Colored National Labor Union because Black workers were excluded and denied membership from all the unions of the day. A.J. Muste, of course, Congregationalist and Quaker, union organizer, founder of the American Textile Workers Union, and opposed to all wars. Fannie Lou Hamer, we know her as a mainstay of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which Peter could tell you about at any time, and Freedom Summer. And she also helped organize the Mississippi Freedom Labor Union in 1965 that organized Black workers in the South across all job categories. And finally, Dolores Huerta, who with Cesar Chavez started the United Farm Workers Union in 1962 and led the grape boycott in 65. You could say that these figures, and many more in the 20th and 21st century, were organizing on an intersectional basis, probably before any of them knew the words. They made the connections. And so maybe we should make sure that we're on the same page if we want to understand the goals that have inspired the best of the labor movement. Are we talking just about jobs? And I say just in air quotes, and another nickel in our paychecks? Well, here's what a top labor leader said in 1893 in answer to that question. In answer to the question, what does labor want? He replied, we want more schoolhouses and less jails, more books and less arsenals, more learning and less vice, more constant work and less crime, more leisure and less greed, more justice and less revenge. In fact, more of the opportunities to cultivate our better natures. After the Great Lawrence Textile Strike in 1912, which then later became called the Bread and Roses Strike, that was the cry. We want bread, the means to sustain our lives, jobs, but we also want the chance to enjoy our lives, roses too. Working class people are not a monolith in favor or against war, although when polls have been done, particularly during Vietnam, we found out that working people generally did not favor the Vietnam War as opposed to middle class and upper class people. There are, I'm sure, a number of important reasons for that. The relationship between unions and the peace movement and the issues have always been contentious and full of paradoxes, as I mentioned before. Beginning, I would say, mostly in the beginning, let's say beginning of the 20th century, with 1917 and World War I, where mainstream unions backed Wilson and Woodrow Wilson, the American bankers and the industrialists who wanted to go into Europe to protect their interests. But the best unions were always the best anti-war leaders as well. This began with the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, the Wobblies, where from 1917 to 1920, many hundreds of its leaders were charged with sedition, espionage. They were harassed, attacked, jailed, and deported simply for speaking out against the war in Europe. The jail in my hometown of Hartford, Connecticut, held 100 such prisoners in 1919 and 1920. 100 Connecticut Union people, mostly with foreign backgrounds and foreign names, but they all had one thing in common. They were sympathetic to the IWW and they agreed with the anti-war stance. Organizing against the war and paying the price were also Eugene Victor Debs, founder of the IWW and the Socialist Party and the American Railway Union. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison for reading a speech that was deemed anti-war in a 1918 rally in Canton, Ohio. And there are others, Kate Richards O'Hare, Mother Jones, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. They were all at one time or another harassed, slandered, jailed for their association with the anti-war movement. World War II, not so much. Unions signed no strike pledges during this period, even though at home their wages stagnated and workplace injuries and deaths went sky high during World War I. There were pacifists who were identify themselves as working class, but that's as far as it went. I think Vietnam is an important place to really focus on, and we need to know this history, I think, if we're going to work on these issues. The most active unions against the war in Vietnam were centered mostly in New York. The Hospital Workers Union, which is my union, 1199. I'm retired now. The Public Workers and the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. The United Electrical Workers, UE. And on the West Coast, the International Longshore and Warehouse Workers. There was a short-lived Labor Assembly for Peace, which was an attempt to break out of the official cheerleading by the AFL-CIO, the dominant unions, and dominated by George Meany and other cold warriors. The Labor Assembly for Peace was chaired in part by Walter Reuther from the United Auto Workers. Now let me get to more recent history that some folks are probably more familiar with, and that's the wars in the Middle East for the last 20 years. And let me give you a small story. In 2003, about 150, 200 members of my union in Connecticut met in Hartford. And they were delegates, so they represented another 20,000 people. They debated the impending invasion of Iraq at this delegate assembly, as we called it. These rank and file activists were a very mixed group. There were military veterans from various wars and conscientious objectors. There were family members of active duty soldiers and mental health workers, since this is a healthcare union, mental health workers who had dealt with the impact of war on returning veterans. And in the end, they overwhelmingly voted to approve a resolution opposing the unilateral and preemptive war against Iraq. My union then took that momentum to the SEIU convention, which had about 1,000 delegate workers representing about 20 million workers. And we were able to duplicate that same effort. And believe it or not, there weren't lots of floor fights, and it wasn't like everybody was in lockstep, but that's how profoundly unhappy people were with the administration's rush to war. Since that time, we built U.S. Labor Against the War, which is the only permanent coalition I think this country has ever had of union folks against U.S. aggression. Now it's called U.S. Labor Against War and Racism, and it has spread its mandate out, I think properly so. It's a good organization to look up to see what they're about. I've been an activist since the late 1960s, first against the war in Vietnam and for civil rights, and then as a tenant organizer and a community organizer, and then a labor organizer for 35 years until I retired. It was always clear to me that there was a lot I did not know about other movements. I only knew about what I was doing, and that I had to learn. This during the 60s and the 70s. I did know that I could learn from them, and it wasn't always comfortable, but I always found people who were willing to teach me, who were in the movements themselves, whether it was the Black Liberation Movement or the labor movement. So we worked to put together organizations. They only lasted as long as the issue did. One called City Workers Against Apartheid, and this was for the divestment campaign. This may be where Arnie Alpert, who's on the line tonight, and I might have met, because he was working on the same issue at the same time before the Clamshell Alliance. And the divestment would be divesting pension funds from corporations that do business in South Africa. Now, messing with a workers' pension fund is, that means business. So the question was, can we support the freedom struggle in South Africa effectively by doing the divestment campaign? This was a major issue that we had to answer before we could move forward. Today in Connecticut, there is the Labor Network for Sustainability, and people who know Jeremy Brecker and know his work. This is a labor group that's been working on the common issues, the common ground that they have on a number of issues, and have decided to move forward, win public support and legislation in Connecticut around a just transition from climate-killing jobs to peacetime jobs. The progressive labor movement has a good track record on peace and justice issues, and it has been getting better, I would say. Think of Turtles and Teamsters in the 1999 battle in Seattle, the 2011 Occupy Wall Street movement, and the Black Lives Matter movement. They have all been very seriously, if very quietly, supported and are stronger for labor's participation. So let me end with a couple of lessons that I think I've learned and I'm still trying to learn when working on this alliance issue. First, to build around the obstacle. So maybe you can't go down to Groton tomorrow to Electric Boat and General Dynamics and knock on the door of the union federation down there, the Metal Trades Council, and say, hey, we want to talk to you about peace and getting rid of all nuclear weapons. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. But if you can't, you start by working around that big nut that you have to crack. And you do that by finding the people who are unionists and are anti-war. They are progressive. They're there. You just got to get them in the same room together, right? You have to make sure that you're working on a common issue. And that's number two, finding the common ground. One of the things we did do after the anti-nuclear power and anti-nuclear movement sort of crossed over together, back around 1980, 81, in Connecticut, we had an economic conversion conference, and that is just transition, getting the jobs out of building nuclear weapons and other defense industry jobs and moving towards peacetime work. And economic conversion was what we called it. And I haven't heard that term now in 3 decades or more. That's something that we have to be talking about again. And this is where the Green New Deal comes in, because I think that's exactly one of the planks of the Green New Deal. Third, don't be a dilettante. I learned that word. I have a dictionary word every day. And I learned, don't be a dilettante. We should study, incorporate long-range planning, identify those union members in our own ranks, rather than just going halfway around the world to find somebody, and challenge our own stereotypes. Because while Will has said progressive Democrats are pro-union, that is true with some progressive Democrats. I don't call myself a Democrat. I call myself a progressive, depending on what audience I'm in. But I think people just don't think about these issues. They'll put on one hat and go to a rally and then put on another hat and go to another group's rally. But in terms of understanding and kind of spending the time and energy they need, I don't think any of the Democratic Party has been working on that for a long, long time. And then finally, don't blame the members, whether it's our members in our peace groups or labor union members. This is the biggest mistake that young organizers that I've worked with over the years commit all the time. They think that if they have not gotten enough people to the picket line or the organizing meeting or the negotiations or whatever, that it must be because the members are apathetic, right? And in my union, you never blame the members for their failure to show up to the event. Never, ever. What we do, and boy, I got that pounded in. We have to look at how we have failed to motivate them, how the shortcomings of our strategy and work habits have interfered with that. And remember that when we ask somebody to join with us, we're not asking them to do us a favor. There's no reason to feel guilty about it. Well, would you please come to my meeting? Because this is a mutual benefit, right? Peace, no nuclear destruction, a changing world, that benefits us all. And so I think there's a lot of work to do, but it has been done, as I've talked about tonight. And history shows that the alliances have succeeded, that current experience shows that the nuts and bolts of organizing never really change. And the doomsday clock is set at 100 seconds before midnight, So that shows us that we have no time to lose. Thank you. Thanks for your attention.
All right. Thank you, Steve. Peter, you wanna try to follow
Sure.
that up?
Yeah, I'll try to follow that up. The first thing I want to say is that, and the first, I think, most important thing to understand about unions is unions are about class. They're about working class people. And very often when we deal with people from other organizations, that tends to be a point of contention, although it's not always obvious. And the other thing is that most union people who tend to interact organizationally with other people represent a lot of people. And so there, you can't exactly just say whatever it is on your mind. You're always conscious of the fact that you represent other people because they elected you. And so you need to represent them. My favorite saying to kind of bring out the class issue is this when it comes to war. And that is, war is that unusual situation where you find workers on the opposite side of the same gun. Now, that being said, I think what I'd like to do is to give you some background to help people understand the institution of organized labor. We have to recognize that the institutions that we inherit define the parameters of what we do. Unless we have a revolution, that's how we act. We act within the perimeters of that institution. And so I want to give you 3 examples of institutions within organized labor historically. One is the Knights of Labor. The second is the American Federation of Labor. And the third one is the National Labor Relations Act. And this will be very brief. The Knights of Labor existed in 1887. There were 1 million members of the Knights of Labor in the United States. It was the, if you could call it, dominant union. It was the union with the most members in the country. Very different from anything you could imagine today. The Knights of Labor had a theory about the world they lived in, and they had an understanding about what they wanted to see. They wanted to see a world where all the economic institutions were consumer and producer cooperatives owned by the workers. They were integrated, black and white. They fought for women's rights, equal pay for equal work, and women's suffrage. And I can go on in terms of, their progressive nature. However, some of the unions got disillusioned with this approach, and they broke from the Knights of Labor in the early 1890s. And those are the unions that became the American Federation of Labor. They had a very different understanding and way of and looking at the world that they wanted to see. The other thing I should say about the Knights of Labor was that they believed they could create change with the power of the ballot and the boycott. Sadly, or as you might expect, as soon as the boycotts were successful, they were declared illegal by state legislatures. And even today, the secondary boycott is still illegal for workers to exercise, unlike peace groups, for example. Anyways, the AFL said, well, what we want to see is we want to see a world where we don't participate in politics, that we have contracts with employers under basically that was their constitutional right that they wanted to exercise was contracts. And so they wanted to do anything but get involved in politics. Now, they did end up getting involved in politics because they found that in order to defend what they had, they didn't want to lose it at the ballot box, basically. But they never had, and to this day, in my opinion, really have an understanding and a way to look at a new world, a world made up of, workers, where workers run things. And so in a lot of ways, to me, and it's something I struggle with pretty much my whole adult life, was why is it that unions that I belong to for the most part, didn't have any broad understanding of the society they lived in and had a vision of what it was that they wanted to change within it. And so today, mainly you still find unions because we inherited the institution of the American Federation of Labor, not the Knights of Labor, not the IWW, without this broad understanding of the society and our role within it and how we want to change it. Third thing I wanted to mention was the National Labor Relations Act, because that governs a lot of what our institutions have become in organized labor. And essentially, the National Labor Relations Act, the purpose of it was not to give workers rights. It was to help create a full production economy. That's the purpose of the National Labor Relations Act. The only reason there were workers' rights in there, and there really aren't that many of them, was because they recognized, the Roosevelt administration and Franklin Roosevelt recognized that if you wanted to have a full production economy, you couldn't have many strikes. And so the way to deal with that was to institutionalize the nature of unions so that they'd be controlled by the government. To this day, workers don't have freedom of speech, right? You think about where you spend most of your time awake is at work, where you do not exercise your constitutional rights. Now, they might say, well, yeah, you can talk about union business or representing other workers or talk about collective action in non-production areas on non-production time. That's supposedly your protected activity as a union member under the National Labor Relations Act. Anyways, I know that there are a lot of questions, and I just wanted to lay out a little bit of background so that if you didn't know this stuff, it would give you some idea about who you're dealing with, like where they're coming from and why. And one other thing I wanted to say was that when you want to talk to union people generally, you can talk to people individually. You could knock on the door of any union. You may or may not get heard. In most cases, you probably will. But the hardest thing to do in any kind of organizing, and the most important thing to do, is establish trust. If you want to have a good discussion with somebody, they got to trust you. And that's as true with unions as with any other group. Anyways, I'll let it go at that.
Thank you so much, Peter. All right, folks. So the way we tend to do Q&A is for people to enter their questions in the chat, and then I'll read them off. But if you prefer to ask a question yourself, feel free to put an asterisk in the chat or use the hand raise function on Zoom. I can't see everyone's face right now, so don't raise your hand on the screen. I might not see you, but if you want to if you'd like to ask yourself, put the asterisk in the chat or use the hand raise function, and I should be able to see that. Give people a second to type. Steve asks, did Grace get the audio working? I'm hoping, Grace, you are hearing us, right? I don't think she'd still be here if she couldn't hear. Yeah, great. So I'll ask a question, since I'm not seeing anything in the chat quite yet. Part of our work, or my work at New Hampshire Peace Action, and our organizational work, is about Pentagon spending, and not just going to war, not just nuclear weapons and the threat of elimination. How do we exercise? How do you think that somebody who, for instance, I'm a veteran of the Iraq War, and I'm somebody who's very committed to this work, just on its own. And I also want to be in solidarity with labor, but it's hard for me to know how to do Pentagon spending work when I know there are so many people in labor who depend on that money for jobs. And I wonder how to do solidarity and do my work responsibly. And that's kind of the general is one of the major themes. But can you speak specifically to that, to that paradox, as Steve put it? How do we do this work being respectful that we are in a way doing in a mode of assaulting people's jobs, livelihoods?
I'll answer if you want. Steve, I think that the paradox is tremendous. And I think part of the problem stems from, in the most recent time, from the period of McCarthyism. And that is that we haven't since then had a real left, that is a real socialist movement in this country, or organizations. And I don't mean democratic socialists. I mean people who opposed, capitalism as such. And so what we were left with after McCarthyism destroyed that kind of thinking for the most part in this country, and the organizations that existed that promoted it, they've never come back. So what we've been left with is single issue organizing. I don't think this is the kind of thing you can solve in the long run with single issue organizing. You can go to the gates of any plant. I have one here in the town I live in, North Berwick, whether it's Pratt and Whitney, which isn't organized. I could go down to the shipyard in Kittery or in Bath. Both of those places, I can get in the door. They know me. I can talk to the executive board. They'll listen to me. But they're going to ask a question I don't have the answer to, and that is that, well, Peter, if you think we should close this place down, how do I feed my family tomorrow? I don't have the answer. And so I think without a really broad movement, once you have a broad movement, as anybody who's been through a strike, I think, can tell you, when people begin to see themselves as being much bigger than their particular job, their particular family, they're willing to make great sacrifices. But in order to build that, in order to have that, you need a movement that really has a different way of looking at the society that they're in. In fact, by definition, a movement is only happens when you have a counterculture. A movement has a counterculture, otherwise it's not a movement. I don't think we have that counterculture. And so I know you're probably interested more in hitting the home run, but I think that's the paradox, that's the dilemma. Brother Steve, I know you want to weigh in on this one.
Well, everything you said, Pete, is much better than I could say it, and it really complements some of the things that I said. Yes, there are a lot of defense workers in this country. There's maybe 800,000, but there are 158 million workers in this country who aren't connected to the defense industry directly. Now, they may be cops, they may be in the military. No, not in the military, really, but they may be cops, they may be in various other security forces. I think that you don't ask people to come out for disarmament and then their place closes down and then you try to figure out where they can get a job. That's obviously the wrong way around that. That unless there is that guarantee, then or the prospect of that guarantee, then if you haven't done that work, then why even bother talking about that? Now, that's the same exact issue that happens when workers go on strike. I've had this conversation 100 times, 200 times. A worker who is too afraid of losing the really precarious position they are in economically, because they are low-wage workers, they may work 2 full-time jobs, they may have kids and only one adult member of the family if that's the case, there are some people who are going to be scared to death of that. And then there are other people who understand the inequity of the situation and how bad it is, how insulting it is that the boss is acting this way when he's making millions and you can't put food on the table without having to work 2 jobs to get 1 paycheck. So you have both kinds of folks to work with, and the people who are ready to go, they become your leaders. I don't have to go talk everybody into joining a strike. They do. And I've been talking a lot. So let me just say one quick thing. At the University of Connecticut School of Social Work, every year a teacher there asked me to come in and talk about labor. And I was like, okay. So I did that a couple times. And I was very unhappy with it. I don't know what the students really felt. And the teacher was perfectly happy, kept bringing me back. And then finally, the request came at a time where I was on strike. And these strikes are, they knock the tuck right out of you. And so I brought 5 or 10 strikers with me. And I said to the class, make believe you're going on strike tomorrow. What's the thing that scares you most? And of course, they all had great answers to that. I'll lose my pay. People will make fun of me. My family will hate me. I'll never get another job. I won't be able to make the mortgage. All these things, real issues. And I had the strikers tell the students how they answered those questions for themselves. And man, if you could bottle that, you'd make $1 billion. It was amazing. They had thought through these things. They were ready to take the risk. The reward is never that great in terms of monetarily, although sometimes there are really great leaps forward. But the issue is, is their self-image, is the way they feel about themselves and their coworkers better or worse after the strike? And it's better. They feel like they've stood up for themselves. They've gotten something from the boss that he did not want to give and was willing to put up with people picketing his place for a week or a month or a year. And that's spectacular. And that's that's the secret weapon. The secret weapon are the people who have gone through it before.
I have one other thought, and that is that, it seems to me, and this goes back to the nature of the institution that you inhabit. And so if you're in a peace institution, anti-war institution, you tend to focus on the corporations that make money off of war. And then the workers who are in those companies. But the fact is today, there are a lot more workers in the private sector is probably dominated by, war materials, workers who make things for war. However, the public sector, that's not true. State workers are not tied to the military industrial complex the way some private sector union workers are. And so if I was being strategic about who I wanted to talk to in terms of workers and unions, I would go to the public sector. That's true of a lot of issues over the years. But today, the dominant unions are the public sector unions. Now, obviously, they were influenced by their sisters and brothers in the private sector, through the joint organizations we have, like state AFL-CIOs and local AFL-CIO councils. But I mean, I think that's another way to begin to look at how to approach organized workers is to do it strategically. And to do that, you have to, as you can see, break your mindset, just change mindset some in terms of what you thought were your priorities, like the way the street you got to go down isn't directly going to the corporation that produces armaments, but it's to another set of workers who are much more likely to identify with peace. So,
All right. While we were speaking, the questions have been coming into the chat. So I'm going to start with a comment from Thea. It has felt to me for a long time that big labor has come to mirror corporations, and at the top levels, labor has come to have more in common with corporations than with worker interests. More a comment than a question, but I'm interested in others' thinking. How do you feel about labor leadership right now, Steve and Peter? It's a topic I know nothing about. So
I second that emotion. Yeah,
I third
thank
it.
you. I see the labor leadership the same way I see the Democratic Party. They are not your main enemy. They are more often an obstacle to deal with. And my own work on a city or statewide level has been thwarted many times by conservative union folks. And the first thing they do is they red bait you. I thought red baiting was gone, but this is back when I was like in my 20s and 30s. They were still doing it, and they red bait you and discredit you, not on the issues, and then they try to co-opt you. And then if you just maintain and then they say you can't use the word labor in the title of your organization. And I'm like, you can say, labor for Joe Lieberman, but I can't say labor for peace. So you just got to move past them. The bureaucrats of the AFL-CIO have been around for 70 years now. 70 years. Maybe more, right? I mean, there's always been a strain through there, but I mean, they've had a tight control, since the 1950s. Now, my union, for instance, stopped its membership in the AFL-CIO because there was a much better way to spend the dues money, and that was by organizing workers. And in Connecticut, the Connecticut AFL-CIO has never organized one worker, and rarely showed up to our picket lines. Had no capacity to mobilize people. Now, I don't say that to be mean and stinky about it. It's just I don't think they see that as their job. So I don't think about them really at all, and that goes with the national AFL. We know that, for instance, every presidential election, labor bureaucrats have come up with a really good labor package that the presidential candidates endorse and say, we will get this done, and it dies within the first 6 months of the person's term. The later one was, what was the last one we've been dealing with? They all have different names, but basically they're all, let's make it easier to organize, et cetera, and it's all good stuff, but there is no movement to back it up. So I would be very disappointed. I'd be very depressed if I had to depend on them for our successes. We depend on ourselves, and that's how the labor movement came against the war. It came against the war in Iraq. It was hundreds, if not thousands, of rank and file activists and progressives, socialists, and people who had good reputations in the labor movement. Not at the very top, but there's a couple of really good radical unions, and there are a lot of very progressive people who will put themselves on the line, and you start there, I think, and then from the ground up, and then I think they either move or they get out of the way, the labor bureaucrats.
I think it was the the 2004 convention of the National AFL-CIO, the only one I ever went to, where we came out against the Iraq War. And that's the only time I think it's ever happened. But as Steve was saying, is that, yeah, we came out against it, but then what did those unions do? How did they educate members more, et cetera, et cetera. And I won't go into the reasons why I think it happened. That's another subject. But in terms of unions mirroring corporations, it's hard to think why it would be any different. I mean, why should it be any different given the history of corporate power, the Constitution of the United States, the laws and the power that has always been arrayed against organized workers in this country? One of the big differences, I think, and why unions tend to be different in other countries is because they have a parliamentary system, so that you can be in the minority all the time, but still have power because they need you to form coalitions. The United States is a winner-take-all system. And so unless you're the majority, you got nothing. And that's really a tremendous impediment to moving ahead. But I go back to my premise to begin with, and that is that, you know, the institution of the American Federation of Labor and its member unions, and even some of the more radical unions are in a lot of ways not all that different. You know, we're confined by the act pretty much that controls us and the lack of ideology. So the only ideology we have to look at is the ideology proposed by the corporation. And if your strategy is that what you want is contracts with corporations, well, you got to have corporations to have contracts with. I've had that discussion many times with building trades workers, building trades representatives at their meetings, where we say, well, you know, why don't you just take your local union and make it a cooperative and go out and get work? And they say, well, a lot of our members are contractors. How could we do that? I mean, that's just one of the answers. But it's just a question of where your mind is, you know, the things that constrain you. If you don't want to deal with corporations, then you have to do what the Knights of Labor did and the National Labor Union did before it, and that is they started buying companies and running them. But, you know, here's a little known fact. In 1947, John L. Lewis, who was the head of the Mine Workers Union, which was a tremendously huge union at that time. I mean, we ran on coal. And he made the statement that in the latest contract they negotiated with the mine workers, mine companies, mine owners, they were going to get so much money a ton to go into a welfare fund. And he was going to use that welfare fund. He was going to use that money to buy companies. And within a short time, we had the Taft-Hartley Act. And there's a clause in the Taft-Hartley Act that basically says workers cannot control their own pension funds. We cannot, it's illegal for us to control our own pension funds. The most we can ever negotiate is having half of the board. But we're also controlled by the fact that we have to invest our money using, in quotes, the prudent man rule, which basically means we're limited to investing in stock in blue chip companies. I mean, there are a few exceptions. There are a few things you can do around the edges. But basically, that's it. So on the one hand, they strip you of all your power, your economic power. You can't boycott. And it goes on and on and on. You're left with a law that's rarely enforced. So where do you go? What do you look at if you don't have a real alternative society that you're trying to build? So of course you act like the corporations do. Who else are you gonna, you know, what other image you're gonna follow in terms of the top leadership?
So unfortunately, we are just about out of time. I'm gonna give Gail Kinney's question. I'm gonna skip yours, Herb. Sorry about that. So Gail asks, and if you can keep your responses super brief, just so that we don't run people too far past the 8 o'clock mark. A question primarily to Steve, but also to both. Have you had direct experience dealing with workers at Electric Boat? If so, have you succeeded in finding those workers who understand the issues you both have raised tonight? I work closely with both the MTC and MDA, particularly during massive layoffs when the workers wondered how they would survive. I'd love to hear some specific stories about your practical and successful approaches to such workers who feel their survival is totally dependent upon war and ramped up militarism. Peter, perhaps you can say more about your dealings with BIW and PNSY too. I will say I know none of those acronyms. So I'd love an explanation of what those are too as you go.
Yeah, Metal Trades Council and the Marine Draftsmen Association are the unions and Union Federation that represent workers at Electric Boat and General Dynamics. And I have not had extensive experience. In fact, if you want to know somebody who's really spent a lot of time talking to those workers, it's the War Resisters League folks down there, Joanne Sheehan and the other folks. They've spent years talking with them, but they don't have any kind of project going on. The times that I have worked with nuclear workers is around health and safety issues. That's the common ground approach. And these were people who were already rebels. And so it wasn't like we were going to get a vote to oppose nuclear weapons any time soon.
Well, BIW stands for Bath Iron Works. They employ about 7,000 people now, I think, in Bath, Maine. And the major union there is now the machinists. It used to be the shipbuilders. And when it was the shipbuilders, for example, we had a number of Maine unions that opposed the continuation of Maine Yankee nuclear power plant operating. And they were part of that. The union itself was part of that coalition. And I didn't find it very hard to bring them along. If I was to go to that union and say, well, and the other thing I wanted to say about that was the union with past owners, now that General Dynamics has it, they have no interest in developing other sources of income besides military. But the previous owners and the unions had started to work together to basically see if they could get out of the military industrial complex and start building windmills and other things. As soon as General Dynamics got control of it, they were asked the question, would they continue down that line? And they said, absolutely not. The only thing we'll ever consider doing is military contracts. So, I don't have a good answer to your question, Gail, and I'm not sure there is one. It's something that we just have to keep trying to work on. But I think we need a vision that's much bigger than the vision provided by organized labor and generally by progressives in this country, if we want to change the dynamics about what's going on. And I would also suggest that I know Gail's had talked to a lot of workers, and so is Jen Schaefer. Maybe you want to do another program with the two of them.
I'm seeing really in the chat. In the chat, there are a lot of people saying we want to talk about this more. Can you come back? So I'm hoping we can organize that another conversation about labor and the peace movement, because clearly there's a lot more of talking and listening that we all want to do on this topic. So unfortunately, we are out of time. You can stay in touch with New Hampshire Peace Action, checking us out, nhpeaceaction.org. These programs are free and will remain free and open to the public, but you can feel free to go to the donate tab on the website to do that. You can look at any of our programs that have been live streamed under the live stream tab of the website. And just to give a few of the upcoming conversations, next Monday, Becky Field is going to talk about how her spirituality guides her peacemaking. On Tuesday of next week, we're going to show the War Game with Ira Helfand doing a Q&A after. He's the founder of Physicians for Social Responsibility. We have Anthony Harris coming on November 22nd. He's going to talk about his work for decarceration, getting people out of jail. December 6th will be Doug Bogan. He's going to talk to us about offshore wind. And December 20th, we'll have Ellen Grow, who's going to talk about ending homelessness in New Hampshire. Peter and Steve, thank you both so very much for coming on today and leading this really rich discussion. And I hope we can have you back and maybe add Jan and Gail to that table so that we can flush this conversation out a little more.
You're welcome.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Have a good
Nice
night,
to see
everyone.
everybody.
Night.